So I'm back with Dr. Bill Stell. We're talking about myopia.
That's the Dr. Bill you don't have to pay.
That's right. Yeah, right. We'll discuss the bill later, Bill. I wanted to get back to this discussion about myopia and a term that I struggle with a little bit, and that is the term myopia epidemic. Okay. And so I wonder if you could describe this concept to me, this notion of a myopia epidemic. Is there an epidemic? Is it catching, Dr. Bill? What's going on with the numbers? Is this something we see worldwide?
Okay. Certainly, this is not an epidemic in the same sense as the epidemic of an infectious disease. Myopia is not catching.
It's not catching.
In that sense.
Okay.
No. This term is used to describe the fact that the numbers of people becoming myopic and becoming more and more myopic has increased dramatically over the past 2 or 3 decades.
2 or 3 decades only?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So before that, for example, let's take Beijing, China, big, huge Asian city as an example. 30 years ago, the prevalence rate of myopia in that city was probably something in the 20%. And
forgive me, just to interject, when we say myopia, we're talking about any myopia?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And at that point, a distinction wasn't made between mild school-age myopia and highly progressive pathological high myopia. But now in Beijing, the statistics are something like 80 or 90% of university graduates are clinically myopic. Now, that doesn't mean that they're all highly myopic. Some of them are only 0.51 diopter. But that was also the criterion 20 or 30 years ago. So more people are myopic, and the average level of myopia that's developed is higher now than it was. This is particularly true in large cities, particularly true in Asia, but here in Canada, the prevalence rate has gone up from 20% to somewhere in the 30s or 40s. I'm not sure exactly what.
Is that across the board, or is it based in ethnicity?
No, it's not. It's not ethnic. And a wonderful study was done comparing ethnic Chinese in, I think, Singapore or Guangzhou, mainland China, with people of the same ethnicity in Sydney, Australia. And the Chinese in Sydney, Australia, who had the same genetic pool and probably similar activity patterns and certainly similar diet to those back in mainland China, the Chinese in Sydney had the same 20 or 25% prevalence rate
as
the general population, whereas in Guangzhou it was going up 70, 80, 90%. So there's one looks to some environmental influences that are characteristic of a population. And I think the emerging consensus is that schooling has become so competitive in Asian societies in particular, and to some extent worldwide, that kids now, a Chinese kid will get up, maybe study a little bit before going off to high school, spend all morning in class, and then rest indoors at lunchtime because the teachers think, or the administration thinks, that these teenage kids need to rest.
Right, yeah.
Then they get back to working indoors under the modest level of indoor lighting. Then they go home as fast as they can and resume studying or take a break playing their indoor games. They're really not getting much outdoor activity. So I think, and even at the same time, in rural areas where kids are either not going to school at all because they're needed to help work the farm, just to put enough food on the table, or they might, as some people I know in the rural Philippines, they might have to hike 5 or 10 kilometers to get from home to school.
Yeah, right.
And they're doing that in a well-lighted environment. So in rural Philippines, some studies I've been involved in, the prevalence rate up to age 12 is below 5% in rural areas. But in the big city and Cebu City, it's 50 or 60% at high school age.
So what's going on in North America then? Are we seeing equivalent rises?
Not as high, because I think the educational pressures, the competition isn't quite so extreme in North America as it is elsewhere. But certainly the incidence and prevalence rates have gone up some. One thing that's interesting to me is that I don't have exactly the stats, but I can dig them up for you. In Finland, where even the outdoor lighting so much of the year is not very intense, but in Finland, the school authorities believe that intensive schooling in the age range 5 to 12 is not so important.
Right.
And they spend a lot of time outdoors all year long. So, hey, the snow comes, strap on the skis, and spend an hour going around on the skis before you come back in to do schoolwork.
Sure, yeah.
So they have a low prevalence rate.
So they also have a very low rate of behavioral concerns in the classroom. Okay.
Good to know.
These children definitely have very strong scanning skills, saccadic skills, for example. And that's what I find around here. Children who are busy have very strong visual skills. And so in North America, we've certainly, as you mentioned, we've seen a bit of an increase as well, not as much as in parts of East Asia. Are we talking about similar progression in South Asia? Are we seeing similar sort of movement there as well? Yeah.
Singapore, Hong Kong, Guangzhou, everywhere in China.
In India?
I think so. And as I mentioned, in the Philippines.
And it seems to be the common thread here seems to be exposure.
Well, the common thread seems to be the intensification of school competition.
Okay, sure. And so
Chinese kids have to take an examination to go from junior high school to high school.
Right. And it's a lot of hours indoors under intense pressure.
Yeah.
And then perhaps there's an element of the near-induced transient myopia as well.
I don't think so.
Are you familiar with the submariner study some years ago, 40 years ago maybe? A group of submariners were found to be, they would develop, it was essentially a near-induced transient myopia from living in such close quarters. And this was taken as evidence that proximity was certainly a factor.
Yeah, but that's picking and choosing a particular factor to focus on.
Right.
And what do you think is the light intensity level in a submarine?
Right.
Come on.
And then likewise studies, and I'm not a big fan of this word, but Eskimo studies of the Inuit people, and found that when education was formalized in the 50s, that there was a shift in progression as well towards more myopia.
Right.
And again, I think we can safely say that these kids were taken from an environment where they were out in the open and boxed into classrooms. Yeah. It's interesting to note as well that starting in the late 80s, early 90s is when we saw a huge proliferation in the availability of cheap, fun, addicting gaming systems, which now lured millions of children into basements for countless hours of fun and leisure, but at the expense of what? And so just on that, as an aside, people ask me about video games in clinic, and my response is to suggest that there's nothing wrong with it inherently, but it should be treated like junk food and approached as such, because too much of a good thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And used in small doses and with compensatory time under other conditions.
And doing other things.
Yeah.
And so not only are we blocking availability of light, but we're also very much restricting movement, and we're creating a dependency on instant gratification. It's a triple whammy for the classroom. It's really problematic. You know.
So let me address for a minute, if I can, what I think about time outdoors.
By all means.
The main emphasis has been on light intensity. And clearly, the outdoor light, on average, in the middle part of the day, is, as I said before, 100,000, maybe even more times more intense than indoor light.
Right.
But there are lots of other things involved in being outdoors. Activity, as you've mentioned. But at least it has been shown by similar epidemiological studies that athletic activity per se is not the key factor outdoors.
Right.
You can be sitting on a park bench reading.
Right.
And something about outdoors is, well, so what else? Well, higher light level causes very significant changes in how the retina works. When we go from a low light level to high light level, our retinas adjust and our brains adjust too, to increase contrast sensitivity, and in particular to increase the sensitivity to contrast at higher spatial frequencies, fine detail.
Right.
It's intuitive that that would happen. That's what we need, and that's what our retinas can do.
So better detail in brighter light.
Better detail in brighter light. And accompanying that, we've got a greater degree of sustained pupillary constriction, which improves optics.
Better depth perception.
Well, and reducing depth perception, okay, that's part of it. But to me, the key thing though is that by constricting, the pupil eliminates focusing by the peripheral part of the ocular lens, which is the part that contributes most of spherical aberration.
Right. So getting a sharper image.
Getting
with
a sharper
smaller
image.
aperture.
Yep. And of course, the evolutionary pressure is that you can do that when there's enough light.
Right.
So it's obvious why it's coupled to light. Other things that are true outdoors, even if you're not doing some activity, there's more movement of things in the field of vision.
More variety in the peripheral field as well.
More variety of spatial frequencies, contrasts, but certainly change of position and time.
I just wanted to notice one thing, is that when going back to the video game concept, typically what we have is a very busy central field surrounded by darkness. And so in terms of form deprivation, would you think that possibly that's a kind of form deprivation? For a small child sitting in an environment where they have a small portion of the field, the central field, which is very active, but the rest is virtually ignored or darkened. Give me your thoughts on that as part of a reason why we might see more of a incidence of myopic children these days. Do you think that would be kind of a form of peripheral form deprivation?
It could be. And also at one time I was thinking, imagine that I were here in this room reading something.
Yes.
Everything out there is out of focus. Everything out there is myopically defocused.
Yes.
And of course, if it's myopically defocused, that should be protective, according to animal studies.
Okay.
So that probably doesn't hold up either. I'm really inclined to think that the quantity of light and the spectrum of light, and to some extent detail and movement, are the primary elements. Yeah.
Can we touch on nutrition briefly?
Sure.
Other than vitamin D?
Sure.
Is there any indication that nutritional elements are at play here? What we eat?
I don't know of any.
There's nothing protective that we're aware of. Eating
yeah.
kale is maybe more protective than potato chips. Who knows?
Eating kale is probably better for you in a lot of ways than eating potato chips,
Right.
but I don't know that.
But we don't have a
myopia.
link to myopia.
No.
Okay, very good. Listen, I want to move the discussion to, I want to talk about blue light.
Yeah.
Okay, just give me 1 second.
Yeah.